Mark Davis, once a Wall Street powerhouse, watches his empire crumble. Betrayed, drowning in scandal, and left with nothing, he prepares for the inevitable collapse. But as he sits at a red light, lost in thought, a teenage window washer wipes his windshield and utters a sentence that makes his blood run cold. "Sir, I know how to save your company." The boy, Jaden Carter, shouldn't know anything about Davis Corporation. But when he mentions a name from Mark's past, a name buried under corporate lies, Mark's instincts scream that this is no coincidence. He has two choices: drive away and let his company die, or listen to the kid who might be his last chance at redemption. Mark Davis had built an empire. Once his name commanded respect. His company, Davis Corporation, had been untouchable. But now, it was collapsing before his eyes. He sat in his office, staring at the cold glow of his computer screen. Headlines mocked him, their words sharp as knives. "Davis Corp in free fall." Mark Davis, from Wall Street, king to corporate failure. Billionaire betrayed, the man who lost everything. His own face stared back at him from the news articles. Hollow eyes, tension in his jaw. A man drowning. The people he trusted were gone. Investors pulled out. The board turned against him. And the worst of them all, David Ford, his business partner, his closest friend. A man who had once built alongside him, and now stood over the ruins. Mark's phone buzzed. A single text from David. "Meet me. Now." Mark exhaled slowly, grabbed his coat, and left without a word. The lounge was nearly empty, the kind of place they had once celebrated in. Deals closed over whiskey, victories toasted beneath the dim lights. But tonight, there was no celebration. David was already seated when Mark arrived, a half-finished drink in his hand. His expression was unreadable. Too calm. Mark sat across from him, his fingers tapping against the table. "Tell me the truth," he said, voice low. "Was this planned?" David swirled his glass. "It's over, Mark." Mark's stomach twisted. "What the hell does that mean?" David set his drink down. He looked at Mark like a man delivering a eulogy. "It means no one's coming to save you." The words cut deeper than Mark expected. "The investors? Gone," David continued. "The board? They've moved on." A slight shrug. "Davis Corp is dead." Mark's breath slowed. For months he had fought, pushed back against every crisis, tried to salvage what he could. And all along, David had known. Watched him struggle. Let him sink. Mark studied the man across from him, looking for something. Regret. Hesitation. Anything. There was nothing. David leaned forward. "You should prepare for what's next." Mark's jaw clenched. He pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. He didn't say another word, and David didn't stop him. Mark drove with no destination. The streets blurred past him, neon lights reflecting against the rain-slick pavement. Everything was gone. His name, once a symbol of power, was now a joke in the financial world. His company, his legacy, had been picked apart, piece by piece, and his best friend had sat back and watched. Mark tightened his grip on the wheel. Was this how it ended? The traffic light ahead flashed red. He barely noticed, his mind spiraling, until a sharp knock on the windshield made him flinch. Mark blinked. A boy, thin, maybe 16, with tired eyes but a steady gaze, stood outside his car, holding a squeegee. His clothes were worn, his sneakers scuffed, but there was no desperation in his face, just certainty. He motioned toward the windshield, a simple gesture. Mark almost ignored him, but something, instinct, fate, or maybe just curiosity, made him pause. He rolled the window down slightly. "I don't have cash, kid." The boy didn't step back. Instead, he leaned in and said something that sent a chill up Mark's spine. "Sir, I know how to save your company." Mark froze. His pulse stopped for a beat. He turned his full attention to the kid, scanning his face, looking for a trick. "What did you just say?" The boy didn't hesitate. "I know who's behind your downfall." The light turned green. Mark didn't move. His grip on the wheel tightened. Everything was gone. Or maybe, not everything. Mark Davis hadn't moved. The green light flickered above him, cars honking in the distance. But all he could hear was the boy's voice, ringing in his head. "Sir, I know how to save your company." Mark studied him through the open window. Young, maybe 16. Rough clothes, worn-out sneakers, but sharp eyes. He wasn't some desperate kid hustling for change. He knew something. Mark's throat tightened. "Who are you?" The boy smirked slightly. "Jaden Carter." The name meant nothing to Mark. Not yet. "All right, Jaden. Mark exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. If this is some scam, it's not. The confidence in his voice stopped Mark cold. Jaden leaned closer, lowering his voice. You want to know who's behind all of this? He held Mark's gaze. Loretta Carter. The name hit like a punch to the chest. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. Loretta Carter. A name he hadn't spoken in years. A name he had buried. The car behind him honked, and Mark snapped back to reality. Get in. Jaden slid into the passenger seat without hesitation, like he knew Mark would say yes. Mark pulled into an empty parking lot, cutting the engine. Talk, he ordered. Jaden sat back, arms crossed. You already know who my mom is. Mark swallowed hard. Loretta Carter. He turned to face him. She was one of my best analysts, until she was caught manipulating financial records. Jaden's jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm. She wasn't manipulating anything. Mark narrowed his eyes. The evidence was airtight. Jaden scoffed. Yeah? And who gave you that evidence? Mark opened his mouth, then stopped. His mind raced back to the scandal. The numbers had been perfect. Too perfect. Everything tied back to her, as if it had been gift-wrapped. And who had handed it to him? David Ford. Mark's stomach twisted. Jaden studied his face. You're starting to get it, aren't you? Mark clenched his fists. If your mother was innocent, why didn't she fight harder? She did, Jaden shot back. But she wasn't just up against you. She was up against your entire system. Mark stayed silent. Jaden leaned in. My mom found something in your company's accounts. Transfers that weren't supposed to be there. The second she flagged them, she was framed and thrown out. Mark's chest tightened. He had signed off on that decision. Trusted his team. Trusted David. But if Jaden was telling the truth, he had been the one played. Mark exhaled slowly. Why come to me now? Jaden's expression darkened. Because David's doing it again. Only this time, he's not just taking down one analyst. He's taking down the entire company. Mark rubbed his temples. And what do you want? Jaden didn't hesitate. Meet my mother. Hear the truth. Mark studied him for a long moment. The kid wasn't begging. He wasn't looking for a payout. He was offering a chance to fix something that should have never happened. Finally, Mark exhaled. Where is she? Jaden's lips curled into a knowing smirk. She's been waiting for you. Mark Davis stood in front of the worn-down apartment building, hesitating. The last time he had seen Loretta Carter, she was being escorted out of Davis Corp. Her career in ruins, her name blacklisted. Because of him. Now, he was here. On her terms. Jaden pushed the door open and walked inside without looking back. Mark followed, his steps slow, uncertain. Inside, the apartment was modest but meticulously organized. The smell of old books and fresh coffee filled the air. Then, he saw her. Loretta Carter. She stood by a desk cluttered with papers, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She didn't look broken. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for this moment. You actually showed up, she said, her voice even. Mark forced a breath. You made sure I didn't have a choice. Loretta nodded, then gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. Mark hesitated, then did as she asked. Jaden leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Silent. Watching. Loretta didn't waste time. She slid a thick folder across the table. Read. Mark opened it. The first few pages were financial statements. Familiar, but wrong. His eyes scanned the numbers and his pulse quickened. Where did you get these? Loretta's expression didn't change. I never stopped looking. Mark flipped through more documents. Hidden transfers. Altered reports. Offshore accounts tied to his name. A sinking feeling settled in his gut. This wasn't bad business. This was sabotage. And then he saw it. The name that made his breath catch. David Ford. Mark stared at the page, his fingers tightening around the paper. He's been orchestrating your downfall for years, Loretta said. Slowly. Quietly. So that when it happened, you wouldn't even see it coming. Mark shook his head. David wouldn't. He did. Loretta pulled out another document. He's been bleeding your company dry, transferring assets, manipulating financial reports. She met his gaze. And guess where most of it went? Mark swallowed hard. Foster Holdings. The name sent a shiver through him. His biggest competitor. The man who had been circling Davis Corp like a vulture for months. And David had handed it to him. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His best friend. His closest ally. The man he trusted above everyone else. And the whole time, he was the knife in Mark's back. Jaden finally spoke. This is what my mom found years ago. His voice was quiet but firm. This is why they framed her. Mark's hands curled into fists. He had helped destroy an innocent woman's career, while the real criminal sat beside him, pretending to be his friend. The betrayal ran deeper than he ever imagined. Loretta crossed her arms. So tell me, Mark. She leaned in. What are you going to do about it? Mark lifted his gaze, something cold settling in his chest. I'm going to bury him. Mark Davis stood at the window of Loretta's apartment, staring at the city below. The world moved on outside, unaware of the storm brewing in this room. A war was about to begin. Behind him, Loretta Carter sat at her desk, flipping through the damning evidence she had spent years gathering. It wasn't enough. Mark clenched his jaw. We can't take this to the authorities yet. We have proof of fraud, but it won't hold up in court. David covered his tracks too well. Loretta nodded. Which means we need something stronger. A confession. A direct link between him and Foster Holdings. Mark turned, eyes sharp. And how do you suggest we get that? From the corner of the room, Jaden Carter spoke. We go inside. Mark frowned. Inside what? Jaden sat on the couch, arms crossed, looking completely unfazed. Tomorrow night, David is hosting a private investor meeting at the Regal Hotel. That's when he's finalizing the takeover deal with Foster Holdings. Mark's heart pounded. He knew about the meeting, but not that it was happening so soon. Jaden continued, voice calm. Too calm. That's where we get what we need. A recording. A confession. Mark scoffed. And how do you expect to do that? Walk in and ask nicely? Jaden smirked. Not exactly. But I know how to get into places I'm not supposed to be. Mark stiffened. Absolutely not. No, he said firmly. That meeting is full of sharks. If David or Foster see you, you won't just get kicked out. You'll disappear. Jaden didn't flinch. So what's your plan then? Hope David confesses out of guilt? Mark exhaled sharply, pacing. Jaden was right. They needed something irrefutable. But sending a kid into a high-stakes corporate war? That was insane. Loretta, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. Mark, this is our best shot. Mark turned to her. You can't be serious. She folded her arms. Jaden isn't a child. He's smart. He's careful. And most importantly, he's the only one who can do this. Mark ran a hand over his face. Every instinct told him this was a mistake. But what choice did he have? His company was already slipping through his fingers. If he hesitated any longer, David would win. He stared at Jaden, trying to gauge just how far the kid was willing to go. Jaden met his gaze. Steady. Unshaken. Mark sighed. He had just lost this argument. Fine, he muttered. But we do this my way. Jaden grinned. Deal. And just like that, the war had begun. Jaden Carter moved through the back hallways of the Regal Hotel, his heart steady, his breath controlled. He had slipped in unnoticed, blending in with the waitstaff carrying trays of champagne. His stolen uniform fit just right, the white gloves concealing the tiny recording device in his palm. The conference room was just ahead. Inside, David Ford and Nathan Foster sat at a long glass table, surrounded by investors, men who had spent years circling Davis Corp like vultures. Jaden moved carefully, keeping to the edges, pretending to adjust empty glasses. No one looked twice at a waiter. He slid closer, close enough to hear the words that would change everything. By this time next week, Davis Corp is gone, David said, his voice smug. Mark won't have a single asset left. Jaden's pulse spiked. That was it. He shifted slightly, adjusting his cuff, pressing record. Nathan Foster leaned forward, grinning. And you're sure everything is buried? David smirked. The stolen assets, transferred to Mark's name, the fake reports, already in place. He'll take the fall, and we'll take the company. Jaden's grip tightened on the tray. They were framing Mark. David chuckled. By the time he realizes what happened, he'll be bankrupt and in court. And once he's ruined, we erase the evidence. Jaden's stomach turned. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a setup. He carefully stepped back, adjusting his path toward the door. He had what he needed. Then, a voice behind him. You. Jaden's breath caught. Slowly, he turned. David stood, eyes locked onto him. Recognition flickered. Jaden bolted. Stop him! The room erupted into chaos. Chairs screeched. Footsteps thundered behind him. Jaden dodged past a server, knocking over a tray of glasses. A crash, a shout. He hit the hallway at full speed. Behind him, David was coming. Jaden sprinted toward the exit, weaving past guests, pushing through a set of double doors. The back hallway was empty. His chance. He heard the security guards closing in. Faster, faster. The alley door was ahead, but locked. Jaden's pulse spiked. Nowhere to run. He spun, spotting a supply cart. One chance. He launched himself over it, knocking it into the guards just as they burst through. A second of chaos. A window of escape. Jaden hit the emergency exit and burst into the cold night air. A black car screeched to a stop. Mark was behind the wheel. "Get in!" Jaden dove into the passenger seat. Mark hit the gas. The moment they were clear, Jaden pulled the recorder from his sleeve. He pressed play. David's voice filled the car. "We erased the evidence." Loretta, sitting in the back, closed her eyes. "We got them." Jaden exhaled, relief washing over him. Then, his phone buzzed. A message. No name, no number, just 3 words. "You're not safe." Jaden's breath caught. David wasn't about to go down quietly. And now, they were all in danger. Mark Davis stood at the podium, staring out at a sea of cameras and flashing lights. The press conference had been announced only hours ago, yet the room was packed. Journalists, business analysts, and investors all leaned in, eager for a final answer to the mystery of Davis Corp's collapse. Mark gripped the edges of the podium. This was his moment. He took a deep breath and spoke. "For months, my company has been under attack. I was led to believe it was my failure, that I had mismanaged my empire, that I was to blame." He paused, scanning the room. "I was wrong, but not in the way you think." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. "The truth is, Davis Corp didn't fall. It was pushed." Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder. "Tonight, you'll hear it for yourselves." With a single click, David Ford's voice filled the room. "By this time next week, Davis Corp is gone." The room fell silent. The stolen assets, transferred to Mark's name, the fake reports, already in place. "He'll take the fall, and we'll take the company." Gasps. Shocked whispers. The sound of pens frantically scribbling. Mark let the words sink in. Then he raised his gaze. That was David Ford, my trusted business partner. The man who sat beside me for years while he orchestrated my downfall. Chaos erupted. Journalists shouted over each other. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters called their networks, live streaming every second. And then, the doors slammed open. David Ford stormed in. His face was red with rage, his jaw clenched tight. He marched toward the stage, his voice booming over the noise. "This is a lie," he roared. "This is nothing but—" Security blocked his path. Mark stepped back, his expression calm. He had already won. David turned, wild-eyed, searching for someone, anyone, who would believe him. The press didn't. The investors didn't. And then, the police walked in. A detective stepped forward, badge gleaming. "David Ford, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy." David's breath hitched. "Wait." The detective didn't hesitate. The cuffs clicked around his wrists. The cameras caught everything. David struggled, eyes darting back to Mark. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think—" Mark met his gaze, his expression cold. "It is for you." David was dragged away. The press exploded. Mark stepped back from the podium, exhaling. It was over. The war had been fought, and he had won. The world had seen Mark Davis fall. The headlines, the scandals, the betrayal. It had all played out in front of millions. The courtroom footage of David Ford being led away in handcuffs was broadcasted on every major news channel. The media painted Mark as a tragic figure, the man who built an empire, only to watch it burn from within. But what none of them knew was that Mark Davis wasn't done. Not yet. Mark sat in the empty executive boardroom of Davis Corporation, or what was left of it. The walls were stripped bare, the once bustling office now a graveyard of abandoned desks and silent phones. The company he built was beyond saving. Even after exposing David's crimes, even after proving his own innocence, the damage had been too great. Investors had pulled out. Clients had walked away. The name Davis Corp was tainted. And maybe, Mark thought, it deserved to die. A knock at the glass door pulled him from his thoughts. Jaden Carter walked in, hands in his pockets, his usual sharp-eyed confidence still intact. Loretta followed, carrying a folder tucked under her arm. "You look like hell," Jaden remarked. Mark let out a dry chuckle. "You sure know how to cheer a guy up." Jaden pulled out a chair, flipping it around before straddling it. "We didn't come to cheer you up. We came to talk about what's next." Mark scoffed. "There is no next. Davis Corp is dead." Loretta stepped forward and placed the folder on the table. "Then it's time to build something new." Mark hesitated before flipping open the folder. Inside were documents, blueprints, financial models, all carefully laid out. A plan. His eyes narrowed as he skimmed the pages. A new company, a new mission, a new name. It wasn't Davis Corporation. It wasn't a corporate empire built on greed, endless competition, and backroom deals. This question mark. This was something different. Mark looked up. You want to start over? Jaden smirked. Not just start over. Start better. Mark glanced at Loretta. You're in on this? She nodded. You spent years fighting for a company that didn't deserve you. You don't have to make the same mistake twice. Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaling. He had spent his life chasing power, wealth, control. And where had it led him? Betrayed, broken, left picking up the pieces. But this was something different. It wasn't about chasing profits. It was about building something real, something that helped people, protected people. His eyes fell back to the folder. At the very top, bold and clear, a partnership, a second chance. A slow smile spread across his face. You're serious about this? Jaden tilted his head. Are you? Mark exhaled, glancing out the window at the city skyline. He had spent so long looking back, at his failures, his regrets, his losses. It was time to look forward. He closed the folder with a decisive snap. Let's build something better. Jaden grinned. Loretta nodded. And just like that, a new empire was born.